The last golden rays of the dying sun silhouetted Mason Ingram against the horizon as he counted the meager coins in his calloused palm. $5.17, all that remained after buying medicine for his 6-year-old son, Timothy, who lay feverish back in their modest cabin outside Montezuma, Colorado. It was 1878, and the winter of 1877-78 had been particularly harsh, claiming not only his wife Sarah to pneumonia, but also most of their savings. Mason adjusted his worn Stetson, the leather cracked from years under the unforgiving western sun. At 32, his face already bore deep lines etched by grief and responsibility. The small mining town of Montezuma wasn't much, nestled in the mountains about 40 miles west of Denver, but it was home the only one Timothy had ever known. He pushed through the swinging doors of Hartley's General Store, the familiar smell of leather, coffee, and tobacco greeting him. The list in his pocket was short but necessary. Flour, coffee, a few potatoes, maybe some sugar if he could stretch his dollars far enough. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. "Afternoon, Mason," called Harold Hartley from behind the counter. The shopkeeper's friendly demeanor had been one constant in Mason's life since arriving in Colorado 5 years earlier, full of dreams about striking silver in the nearby mines. "Harold," Mason nodded, reaching for a small burlap sack to fill with flour. As Mason carefully selected only what was absolutely necessary, the bell above the door rang again. He glanced up to see a woman he'd never encountered before step inside. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, wearing a travel-stained dress that had once been fine. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, though several strands had escaped to frame a face that, despite evident exhaustion, possessed a striking beauty. Harold's eyebrows rose. "Can I help you, miss?" "I hope so," she replied, her voice carrying the refined accent of somewhere back east. "I've just arrived on the afternoon stage. I was told this is where I might purchase provisions." Mason returned to his shopping, though he couldn't help but overhear the conversation as the woman Katherine Vance was her name. He gathered explained she'd come to Montezuma to take up a teaching position that had been advertised back in Boston. Teaching position. Harold repeated, scratching his gray-flecked beard. "Don't recall hearing about any such thing." The woman's face fell, her gloved hand clutching the counter edge. "But I have the letter right here. Signed by a Mr. Wendell Montgomery, chairman of the school board." Harold shook his head slowly. "Miss, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Wendell Montgomery passed on last winter, and there ain't been a school board meeting in Montezuma for nigh on a year now, since the schoolhouse roof collapsed under the snow." Mason watched as the color drained from Katherine Vance's face. Her other hand instinctively went to her reticule, which looked as empty as Mason felt most days. "I see," she said, her voice barely audible. "And the stage to Denver doesn't return until—" "Monday next," Harold supplied apologetically. "Unless you want to try catching a ride with one of the ore wagons heading out tomorrow, but that's no journey for a lady." Mason approached the counter with his meager selections: a small sack of flour, coffee beans, 4 potatoes, and a single can of beans. Harold tallied the total. "That'll be $5.12, Mason." Mason counted out his coins, painfully aware of the 5 pennies that would be left to his name. As he pushed the money across the counter, he noticed the woman opening her purse again, extracting what appeared to be her last few coins and counting them silently. "And a room at the boarding house?" she asked Harold. "What might that cost?" $2 a night, meals included," Harold replied. "Mrs. Peterson runs a clean place, best in town." The woman's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. Mason saw her quickly calculate in her head, the same way he did each time he entered this store. As Mason gathered his purchases, he found himself speaking before he'd fully formed the thought. "Miss Vance, is it? I couldn't help overhearing. Sounds like you've had quite a journey for nothing." She lifted her chin, pride evident despite her circumstance. "It appears I've been the victim of some cruel joke or misunderstanding. I sold most of my possessions to purchase the stage ticket." Mason looked down at the 5 pennies in his palm, the last of his money, until he could find more work at one of the struggling silver mines. Timothy's medicine had taken nearly everything, but his boy's life was worth every cent. He glanced at Katherine Vance again, seeing not just beauty but determination in those green eyes. "Here," he said, extending his hand with the 5 pennies. "It ain't much, but maybe it'll help until you figure things out." Katherine stared at the offered coins, then at the calloused hand holding them. "Sir, I couldn't possibly Mason Ingram," he supplied. "And yes, you can, my boy Timothy and I, we've been through worse, we'll manage." Something passed between them, then an understanding perhaps, or recognition of kindred spirits facing hardship with dignity. After a moment's hesitation, Katherine accepted the coins. "Thank you, Mr. Ingram. I'll repay this kindness as soon as I'm able." Mason shook his head. "No need, Miss Vance. Just pay it forward someday." As Mason stepped out into the fading daylight, his saddlebags lighter than he'd hoped but his conscience clear, he couldn't have known how those 5 pennies would change the course of his life forever. Katherine watched the broad-shouldered cowboy leave, the small copper coins heavy in her gloved palm. They represented more than money, they were a gesture of humanity in a moment when the world seemed to have played a cruel trick on her. With a deep breath, she turned back to the shopkeeper. "Mr. Hartley, is there any work to be found in Montezuma? I'm well educated, capable with numbers," and she hesitated only briefly. "I'm not afraid of hard work." Harold Hartley studied her thoughtfully. "Well, Miss Vance, as it happens, my wife's been after me to find someone to help with the books and correspondence. Mining supply business generates more paperwork than I care for. It won't pay much, but there's a small room behind the store you could use until you get your bearings." That night, as Mason sat beside Timothy's bed, spooning broth into his son's mouth between fever-induced naps, he found his thoughts drifting to the Eastern woman with the determined eyes. He wondered where she'd found lodging and if those 5 pennies had been of any use at all. "Who you thinking about, Pa?" Timothy asked, his voice weak but his blue eyes so like his mother's alert enough to catch his father's distraction. Mason smiled, brushing back the boy's damp blonde hair. "Just someone new in town. A teacher who came all the way from Boston, only to find there's no school for her to teach at." Timothy's eyes widened slightly. "A real teacher, like in the books Ma used to read to me." "I expect so," Mason replied, setting aside the empty bowl. "Now get some rest, that medicine doctor Wilson gave you should start working soon." "Will I meet the teacher lady, Pa?" Mason tucked the blanket around his son's thin shoulders. "I don't know, Tim. She might not stay in Montezuma long, but Katherine Vance did stay." By the end of her first week working at Hartley's general store, her quick mind and pleasant manner had made her a welcome addition. She'd organized Harold's chaotic ledgers, written eloquent letters to suppliers that resulted in better terms, and even helped Martha Hartley rearrange the store's displays to entice customers to purchase more than they'd initially intended. Mason had seen her twice more that week, each time from a distance as he rode into town for work at the Blue Eagle mine, where he'd managed to secure 3 days of employment. His own funds replenished, though barely, he'd nodded politely but hadn't approached her. It was on a Sunday morning when their paths crossed again. Mason had brought Timothy into town for the first time since his illness, wanting his son to attend the church service now that his fever had broken. They sat in one of the back pews of the small wooden church, Timothy fidgeting with his collar as Reverend Thompson delivered his sermon on perseverance through hardship. "And like Job, we must understand that our trials are but temporary in the eyes of the Lord," the Reverend intoned. "Though silver prices continue to fall and our community faces challenges, we must hold fast to faith and to each other." As the congregation rose to sing, Mason noticed Katherine sitting across the aisle, her voice clear and melodious even among the rather unmusical gathering of miners, shopkeepers, and their families. When their eyes met, she offered a small smile of recognition. After the service, as the congregation spilled out into the bright morning sunshine, Timothy tugged at Mason's sleeve. "Is that her, Pa, the teacher lady?" Before Mason could answer, Katherine approached them, her Sunday dress a modest blue calico that somehow made her eyes appear even more vividly green. "Mr. Ingram," she greeted him, then looked down at Timothy with a warm smile. And who might this young gentleman be? Timothy Ingram, madam, the boy answered before his father could, extending his small hand as he'd been taught. Pleased to meet you. Pa says you're a real teacher from Boston. Katherine laughed lightly, shaking the offered hand with appropriate seriousness. I am indeed, though I'm working at Mr. Hartley's store for now. I hear you've been quite ill. How are you feeling? Much better, Timothy declared. Dr. Wilson gave me medicine that tasted awful, but Pa says that means it's working. Your father sounds very wise, Katherine replied, glancing up at Mason with that same smile that seemed to brighten the already sunny day. Mason felt unexpectedly self-conscious under her gaze. Timothy, why don't you go say hello to Billy Reynolds? I see him over by the oak tree. Once Timothy had scampered off, Mason turned to Katherine. You seem to have found your footing in Montezuma, Miss Vance. I'm glad to see it. Thanks in no small part to your kindness, Mr. Ingram, she replied. Those 5 pennies you gave me purchased paper and ink, which I used to write Mr. Hartley a proper job application letter. He was apparently so impressed with my penmanship that he offered me the position that very day. Mason chuckled. Somehow I doubt it was just the penmanship. A faint blush colored her cheeks. Nevertheless, I wanted to thank you properly and to return this. She pressed 5 pennies into his palm. With interest when I'm more established. Mason looked down at the coins, then back at her earnest face. That's not necessary, Miss Vance. Katherine, please, she corrected him. And I insist, a debt is a debt, Mr. Ingram. Mason, he returned. Then, surprising himself, he added, perhaps you join Timothy and me for Sunday dinner. It's nothing fancy, just rabbit stew I put on before church. The invitation seemed to catch her off guard, but her expression quickly warmed. I'd be delighted, though I insist on contributing something. I purchased a small jar of preserves yesterday that would complement a meal nicely. And so began a friendship that the residents of Montezuma watched with interest. Every Sunday after church, Katherine would join Mason and Timothy for dinner at their cabin. Sometimes she brought preserves or fresh bread from the baker. Other times she arrived with a book to read to Timothy, feeding the boy's growing appetite for stories and learning. Katherine thrived at Hartley's, gradually taking on more responsibilities until she was effectively managing the store while Harold focused on expanding his mining supply business. The small room behind the store became her home, which she furnished simply but comfortably with second-hand items purchased with her modest salary. As summer bloomed across the Colorado mountains, Katherine approached Mason after church one Sunday in late June. I've been thinking, she began, as Timothy chased butterflies nearby. There are at least 12 children in Montezuma who aren't receiving any formal education. Mason nodded, having noticed the same. Mining towns aren't known for their schooling opportunities. Most families just teach what they can at home, which is admirable, Katherine agreed, but insufficient. I've spoken with several parents who would welcome proper instruction for their children. She hesitated briefly. I'd like to start a small school. Just 3 days a week initially, using the back room at Hartley's. Harold has already given his blessing. Mason studied her animated face. In the 2 months since her arrival, Katherine had gained a healthy glow that had nothing to do with the mountain sunshine and everything to do with finding purpose in a place where she was needed. Sounds like you've thought this through, he said. Would there be a fee for the families? Whatever they can afford, she replied. Some might pay in eggs or firewood rather than coin. I'm still earning my wage at the store. This would be additional. Timothy would be your first pupil, Mason said, watching his son who at nearly 7 was bright but had only the rudimentary reading and ciphering skills Mason himself could teach. Though I can't offer much beyond gratitude at present. Katherine's hand briefly touched his arm, a gesture that sent an unexpected warmth through him. Your son's eager mind is payment enough. Besides, her eyes twinkled, you've already contributed to the school fund. 5 pennies, as I recall. The following week, Katherine's school opened with 8 students ranging from 5 to 12 years old. Timothy Ingram proudly carried the small chalkboard his father had crafted for him from a smooth piece of slate found near the mine. By mid-July, Katherine's school had grown to 15 students. Word of her patient teaching and creative methods had spread even to the outlying homesteads. Each child brought what their family could afford: jars of honey, fresh eggs, mended clothing, or a few precious coins. One evening, as Mason rode into town after a long day at the mine, he passed Hartley's store just as Katherine was dismissing her afternoon students. The children scattered like startled quail, their laughter echoing down the dusty main street. Katherine stood in the doorway, waving goodbye, her face alight with satisfaction. Mason reined in his horse. "Looks like you've found your calling after all, Miss Katherine." She shaded her eyes against the setting sun to look up at him. "It appears Montezuma needed a teacher as much as I needed a place to belong." After a moment's hesitation, she added, "Would you like to come in for coffee? Martha left some apple cake that's quite good." Inside the store, as the golden evening light filtered through the windows, Mason found himself sharing more of his story than he had with anyone since Sarah's passing. He told Katherine about coming west with dreams of silver, about meeting Sarah in Denver, about Timothy's birth in this very town during a blizzard so fierce the doctor couldn't make it through. "Sarah loved it here," he said softly, turning the coffee cup in his hands. "Said the mountains made her feel closer to heaven. When the consumption took her last winter, I promised her I'd raise Timothy right here, where she could watch over us from those peaks she loved so much." Katherine's eyes were soft with compassion. "You've done admirably, Mason. Timothy is a wonderful boy, kind, intelligent, curious about everything. Sarah would be proud of you both." "Some days are harder than others," he admitted. "A boy needs a mother's touch. I do my best, but—" He trailed off, suddenly self-conscious. "But you worry it isn't enough," Katherine finished for him. "From what I've seen, your best is remarkable." After a moment, she added, "My father died when I was 12. My mother raised 3 daughters alone in Boston, taking in sewing to make ends meet. It was her determination to see us educated that inspired me to become a teacher." "And what brought you all the way to Colorado?" Mason asked. Realizing he'd never heard this part of her story, Katherine's expression clouded slightly. "Necessity, in part. Teaching positions for women in Boston are competitive and without connections." She straightened her shoulders, "and perhaps a desire for adventure. The advertisement promised a new schoolhouse, good wages, and the opportunity to help shape a growing community. It seemed providential. Even though it turned out to be false." She smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed her face. "Sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as misfortune, don't you think?" As summer gave way to autumn, Katherine's small school continued to flourish. Harold Hartley, seeing the benefit to the community and the increased foot traffic in his store, offered to expand the back room to accommodate more students. Several of the miners, including Mason, volunteered their labor on Sundays to add windows and proper desks. The first snowfall came early that year, dusting the mountains with white in late September. Mason worried about getting Timothy to school through the weather, but Katherine solved the problem by arranging for him to stay with the Hartleys on the worst days, their home being just behind the store. It was during one such snowstorm in early November that Mason found himself trapped in town. The path to his cabin was impassable, the snow having drifted higher than his horse's chest in places. Harold offered him lodging above the store, in the small apartment where he and Martha had lived before building their current home. That evening, after Timothy had been settled in the Hartley home, Mason found Katherine still in the schoolroom, arranging books by lamplight. "Shouldn't you be resting?" he asked from the doorway. "It's well past 8. She looked up, startled, then smiled. "I lose track of time when I'm organizing. Besides, with this weather, there's little else to do." She gestured to a shelf of books. These were donated by Mrs. Peterson from the boarding house, her late husband's collection, some wonderful volumes on history and natural science. Mason stepped into the room, examining the titles. "Timothy mentioned you've been teaching them about stars and planets." "Yes," Katherine's eyes lit up. "Children are naturally curious about the heavens. I've been showing them constellations on clear nights." She paused, suddenly shy. "Actually, I've been thinking of asking you something. The older boys need more practical skills than I can teach them." I wondered if you might consider offering some instruction in basic carpentry or perhaps geology, given your mining experience." Mason was taken aback. "Me, teaching? Why not? You're educated, patient, good with explanations. I've heard you describing mining operations to Timothy. He repeats your lessons verbatim." "I never thought of it that way," Mason admitted. "I suppose I could show the boys how to identify promising ore, maybe some basics of timber support construction." "Exactly." Catherine's enthusiasm was contagious. "We could make it a weekly session, the practical paired with the theoretical, a complete education." As they continued discussing possibilities, the lamp burning low, Mason found himself studying Catherine's animated face. In the months since her arrival, she had become an integral part of Montezuma, beloved by the children and respected by their parents. More than that, she had become important to him in ways he was only beginning to recognize. "Katherine," he said during a lull in the conversation, "I'm grateful every day that you decided to stay in Montezuma despite the circumstances that brought you here." She met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "Sometimes I think those 5 pennies you gave me were the most valuable gift I've ever received. Not for their worth, but for what they represented: kindness without expectation of return. I never could have imagined how much would grow from such a small gesture," Mason said softly. The howling wind outside seemed to fade into the background as they sat in the comfortable silence that followed, two people whose lives had unexpectedly intertwined through the simple act of giving. Winter tightened its grip on Montezuma as December arrived. The mountains stood white and majestic against azure skies on clear days, while snowstorms periodically isolated the small mining community from the outside world. Despite the weather, Catherine's school remained open, with parents ensuring their children arrived safely, often taking turns escorting groups from various parts of town. Mason's geology and carpentry lessons for the older boys proved wildly popular. Every Friday afternoon, weather permitting, he would lead them through practical exercises building simple wooden structures, identifying rocks and minerals, learning to read the landscape for signs of water and resources. Katherine observed that attendance on Fridays had never been better, particularly among boys who had previously been reluctant students. "You've got a gift for teaching," she told Mason one Friday evening as they cleaned up after class. The boys had been learning to make basic repairs to buildings, using the schoolroom's own drafty window as their project. "You make them feel capable." Mason shrugged, but couldn't hide his pleasure at her praise. "They just need someone to show them that learning has real purpose." "Not so different from what you do." "Perhaps," Katherine agreed, "though you connect with Jackson Miller and the Thornton boys in ways I never could. They respect you." "And they adore you," Mason countered, watching as she carefully put away supplies. "Timothy talks about Miss Katherine from sunup to sundown." Something soft crossed her expression. "Timothy is special. He has your perseverance and a natural curiosity that's remarkable." She hesitated, then added, "He reminds me a little of myself at that age, always asking questions that adults found exhausting." "Sarah was the same way," Mason said quietly, "always wanting to understand how things worked, why things were the way they were." Katherine nodded, respecting the mention of his late wife. Over the months, she'd learned that Mason spoke of Sarah freely and with love, keeping her memory alive for Timothy but not dwelling in grief. It was one of the qualities she most admired in him, his ability to honor the past while fully living in the present. As Christmas approached, Katherine threw herself into organizing a holiday recitation program. The children practiced poems, songs, and short plays to perform for the entire town on Christmas Eve. Mason helped build a small stage in the largest part of the store, which Harold had cleared of merchandise for the occasion. The evening of the performance, it seemed everyone in Montezuma had crowded into Hartley's general store. Miners stood shoulder to shoulder with merchants, ranchers, and the handful of professional men who called the town home. Mrs. Peterson from the boarding house had organized refreshments, and festive garlands decorated the walls. Katherine stood before the makeshift stage, her green dress complemented by a red ribbon in her hair, looking both professional and festive. "Welcome, friends and neighbors," she began. "Tonight, our students wish to share the gifts of knowledge and art they've acquired these past months. We hope you'll receive their performances in the spirit of joy and community that defines this season." The program began with the youngest children reciting simple poems about snowflakes and Christmas stars. Timothy, who had overcome his natural shyness under Catherine's gentle encouragement, delivered his lines about the journey to Bethlehem without a single mistake, bringing a proud smile to Mason's face. The older students performed a short play about the first Christmas in Colorado territory, which Katherine had researched and written herself. As Mason watched her directing from the side, mouthing the words along with the children and beaming with pride at each successful scene, he felt something shift inside him, a recognition that his admiration for this remarkable woman had deepened into something more profound. After the final carol, sung by all the children together, the audience erupted in applause. Parents crowded forward to congratulate their offspring, and Katherine was surrounded by well-wishers offering thanks for her dedication to their children's education. It was nearly midnight when the last family left, and Mason, Timothy, and Katherine remained to clean up the store. Timothy, exhausted from the excitement, had fallen asleep on a pile of blankets behind the counter. "He was magnificent," Katherine said softly, looking at the sleeping boy. "They all were," Mason nodded, helping her fold the last of the cloth they'd used as stage curtains. "You've given them confidence, Katherine. That's worth more than any lesson in arithmetic or geography." "It's been a joint effort," she insisted. "Your Friday classes, the parents who volunteer, Harold and Martha's generosity with the space, this is truly a community school." They worked in comfortable silence for a few moments before Mason spoke again. "I have something for you, a Christmas gift." From his pocket, he withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Katherine looked surprised. "Mason, you shouldn't have, please," he said, holding it out to her. "It isn't much." She accepted the package, carefully untying the string and folding back the paper. Inside lay a small wooden box, beautifully carved with delicate mountain flowers. When she opened the hinged lid, she gasped softly. Nestled inside, mounted in a simple silver setting, was a piece of rose quartz crystal that caught the lamplight and seemed to glow from within. "It's beautiful," she whispered, lifting the pendant by its leather cord. "I found the quartz in the Blue Eagle mine," Mason explained. "Worked on the carving and setting at night after Timothy was asleep. Rose quartz is rare in these parts. Usually we just find the clear or smoky varieties." "And the box, these carvings are exquisite," Mason's cheeks colored slightly. "I've always whittled a bit. Sarah used to say I had restless hands." He paused. "The columbines are Colorado's flower. I thought, well, I hoped it might remind you that you found a home here. That you belong in Montezuma now." Katherine looked up at him, her eyes bright with emotion. "I couldn't imagine being anywhere else," she said softly. "Oh, I have something for you as well." She hurried to her desk in the corner, returning with a package of her own, somewhat larger and wrapped in proper Christmas paper. Mason unwrapped it carefully to reveal a leather-bound book. Opening the cover, he found pages filled with beautiful handwriting stories, scientific information, historical accounts, and mathematics problems, all organized by subject. "It's a teaching companion," Katherine explained. "I've been compiling it for months, everything I thought might help with Timothy's education as he grows. There are sections on history, natural sciences, mathematics." She trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "I thought perhaps on days when he can't make it to school or during the summer months." Mason ran his hand over the carefully penned pages, understanding the hours of work they represented. "This is the most thoughtful gift I've ever received," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you, Katherine." They stood looking at each other in the quiet store, the sleeping boy nearby, the remnants of the Christmas celebration around them. Mason found himself taking a step closer to her. "Katherine," he began, his heart suddenly racing, "these past months, having you in our lives in my life has meant more than I can properly express." She met his gaze steadily, though a flush had risen to her cheeks. "You and Timothy have become very dear to me as well, Mason." Another step closer. "I find myself wondering what the future might hold for all of us." Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper. "What are you saying, Mason?" "I'm saying that I care for you deeply, that Timothy adores you, that I've come to believe that perhaps we were meant to find each other, even through such unlikely circumstances." A smile trembled on her lips. 5 pennies worth of divine providence, worth more than all the silver in Colorado, he confirmed, reaching for her hand. The kiss they shared was gentle and brief, but filled with promise. As Mason drew back, he saw in Catherine's eyes the same hope and tenderness he felt in his own heart. Timothy stirred on his makeshift bed, murmuring in his sleep. Mason reluctantly stepped away. "I should get him home. The snow has stopped, and the moon is bright enough to light our way." Catherine nodded, touching the rose quartz pendant now hanging around her neck. "Merry Christmas, Mason." "Merry Christmas, Catherine," he replied, gathering his sleeping son. "We'll see you tomorrow for dinner." Her smile was radiant. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Spring came late to Montezuma in 1879, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the mountain landscape with vibrant life. Wildflowers carpeted meadows, aspens unfurled tender green leaves, and the rushing creeks swelled with snowmelt from the higher elevations. Catherine's school had grown to nearly 30 students by April, necessitating a more permanent solution than the back room of Hartley's store. The town council, formed largely through Catherine's own diplomatic encouragement over the winter months, had voted to renovate the old assayer's office into a proper schoolhouse. The building, abandoned when falling silver prices forced the closure of several smaller mines, was structurally sound and centrally located. Mason had been appointed to oversee the renovation, a position that utilized both his carpentry skills and his growing reputation as a civic leader. Though he still worked at the Blue Eagle mine 3 days a week, his increasing involvement with the school and town affairs had given him a new sense of purpose beyond mere survival. On a warm Saturday in late April, Mason and several other men were installing new windows in the schoolhouse when Timothy came running up the street, waving a telegram form. Pa," the boy shouted, his face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Simmons at the telegraph office said to bring this to you right away." Mason climbed down from the ladder, wiping his hands on his trousers before accepting the yellow paper. He read it once, then again, his expression changing from curiosity to stunned disbelief. "What is it, Mason?" asked Frank Reynolds, one of the other volunteers. Mason looked up, his eyes wide. "It's from the Denver Mining Exchange. That claim I filed last fall up in the North Valley. They're offering to buy it. Says there's a significant copper deposit based on the new survey." "Copper," Frank whistled. "With the telegraph and telephone lines going up everywhere, copper's in high demand. How much they offering?" Mason handed him the telegram, still trying to process the news. Frank's eyes bulged as he read the figure. $10,000. "Mason, you're a rich man." Word spread through Montezuma like wildfire. By mid-afternoon, it seemed everyone in town knew about Mason Ingram's good fortune. Catherine heard the news from Martha Hartley while helping to inventory new schoolbooks that had arrived from Denver. $10,000, Martha repeated, shaking her head in wonder. After all the hardship that man's faced, it couldn't happen to a more deserving soul. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she recorded the books in the ledger. "It's wonderful news," she agreed, trying to sound merely pleased rather than revealing the tumult of emotions the news had stirred in her. Over the past 4 months, her relationship with Mason had deepened steadily. They had not spoken explicitly of marriage, though the understanding between them had grown clear to everyone in town. Sunday dinners at the Ingram cabin had become a tradition, and Mason often accompanied Catherine on walks after church or joined her for coffee after school hours. Timothy had taken to asking Catherine for help with decisions that would typically involve a mother's guidance, and she had embraced this role with gentle care. But $10,000 changed everything. It was a fortune in 1879, enough for Mason to buy a proper ranch, to send Timothy to college someday, to build a comfortable life far beyond what Montezuma could offer. Katherine tried to quell the selfish fear rising in her heart, fear that Mason's newfound wealth might lead him away from the small mining town. And from her, she was still wrestling with these thoughts when Mason himself appeared at the store's doorway, his face alight with excitement. Katherine. Have you heard? She set down her pencil and offered him a smile she hoped didn't reveal her anxiety. About your copper claim? Yes, Martha just told me. Congratulations, Mason, it's wonderful news. He crossed the store in a few long strides, taking her hands in his. It changes everything, he said, his eyes bright with possibilities. All those dreams that seemed impossible just this morning, they're within reach now. Katherine's heart constricted painfully, but she maintained her smile. I'm truly happy for you and Timothy. You deserve every blessing. Mason studied her face, his enthusiasm faltering. You're upset. No, not at all, she insisted, withdrawing her hands and turning back to the ledger. It's just a surprise, that's all. Such a significant change in circumstances requires careful thought. Katherine, Mason said softly, turning her to face him again. What do you think I'm planning to do with this money? She met his gaze hesitantly. Build a better life for Timothy, I imagine. Perhaps move to Denver or even back east where there are more opportunities. To her surprise, Mason laughed. Move away from Montezuma, from the school we're building, the community that's supported us, the life we've made here. His expression softened as he took her hands once more. From you, Katherine, never. Relief washed over her, followed quickly by embarrassment at her assumptions. I thought perhaps with such a sum you might want more than our small town can offer. What I want, Mason said deliberately, is to build a future right here with the people I love. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box clearly new and purchased in haste from the jewelry section of Hartley's store. I had planned to speak with you this Sunday after dinner. I even asked Timothy's permission last week, which he enthusiastically granted. But it seems life has accelerated my timeline. Katherine's breath caught as Mason opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small diamond. Katherine Vance, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. From the moment you accepted those 5 pennies, my last 5 pennies in the world, you've brought nothing but richness to my life. Will you marry me and make our family complete? Tears welled in Katherine's eyes as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Yes, with all my heart. Mason slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into a kiss that promised a lifetime of shared joy. When they parted, both slightly breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. Do you know what I plan to do with the money? He asked softly. First, finish the schoolhouse properly with everything you've ever wanted for your students. Then build us a home large enough for our family to grow, and set aside a trust for Timothy's education. It sounds perfect, Katherine murmured, her earlier fears completely dispelled. There's more, Mason continued. I want to establish a scholarship fund for Montezuma's children, so no child with the desire to learn will ever lack the opportunity. He squeezed her hands gently. You've shown me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the difference we make in others' lives. I want our good fortune to become the community's good fortune. Katherine felt her heart might burst with love for this man who, having known poverty and hardship, thought first of giving back rather than accumulating comfort. Mason Ingram, she said, blinking back tears of joy, you are the richest man I've ever known, and it has nothing to do with copper mines. The wedding took place on the first day of June, with the entire town in attendance. The newly completed schoolhouse served as the venue, decorated with wildflowers gathered by Katherine's students. Timothy stood proudly beside his father, bearing the rings on a small cushion Katherine had sewn herself. Reverend Thompson spoke of new beginnings and of love that grows from the smallest seeds of kindness, a reference to the 5 pennies that had become legend in Montezuma. Mason and Katherine exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to face life's joys and challenges together, to nurture their family with love and wisdom, and to use their blessings to benefit others. As Katherine repeated her vows, the rose quartz pendant Mason had given her at Christmas gleamed against her cream-colored gown, a symbol of the unexpected path that had led her to this moment of perfect happiness. The celebration afterwards spilled into the town square, with tables of food contributed by every household in Montezuma. There was dancing to fiddle music, laughter that echoed off the surrounding mountains, and a palpable sense that the union represented more than just two people joining their lives. It symbolized the spirit of community that had flourished under their combined influence. Late in the evening, as the celebration continued under lantern light, Mason led Katherine away from the crowd to a hillside overlooking the town. "I have a wedding gift for you," he said, pointing to a plot of land just visible in the fading light. "Our new home will stand there with a view of both the mountains and the schoolhouse." Katherine leaned against his shoulder, contentment warming her despite the cooling evening air. "It's perfect, close enough to walk to school but with space for a garden and room to grow." "Room for more children," Mason said softly, kissing her temple, "if you're agreeable." She turned in his arms, her eyes reflecting the first stars appearing overhead. "Very agreeable, Mr. Ingram." "I never imagined when I counted out those 5 pennies that I was actually investing in my own happiness," Mason murmured against her hair. "You've given us so much more than I could have dreamed, Katherine, and you gave me a place to belong when I was lost," she replied. "Some might call it chance, but I believe it was Providence that brought me to Montezuma and to you." Below them, the lights of the town twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a family, a story, a part of the community they had helped to strengthen. The distant sound of music and laughter floated up on the evening breeze, a reminder of the celebration continuing in their honor. "Shall we return to our guests?" Katherine asked after a moment of peaceful silence. Mason nodded, taking her hand as they started down the hillside. "Tomorrow begins our new life together," he said. "I can't wait to see what blessings it will bring." 10 years passed, transforming both Montezuma and the Ingram family. The small mining town had weathered the boom and bust cycle of Western development better than many similar communities, largely due to diversification efforts led by Mason and other forward-thinking residents. While silver mining remained important, the town had expanded into lumber production, ranching, and even a small tourism industry catering to those seeking the therapeutic mountain air. The Ingram house stood as promised on the hillside overlooking town, a handsome 2-story structure with wide porches and large windows that captured the magnificent mountain vistas. The garden Katherine had envisioned flourished under her care, providing vegetables for their table and flowers for their home throughout the growing season. Inside, those walls lived a family that had grown in both number and joy. Timothy, now 16, had blossomed into a thoughtful young man with his father's steady nature and his stepmother's love of learning. He excelled at mathematics and engineering, spending hours designing water wheel systems and other mechanical improvements that might benefit the town's industries. Following Timothy in the family order came 8-year-old Sarah, named for Mason's first wife, but possessing Katherine's green eyes and love of literature. At 6, Robert Bobby to the family was all energy and curiosity, constantly dismantling objects to see how they worked, much to his mother's mixed amusement and exasperation. And completing the family was little Elizabeth, just 3, with golden curls and a sweet disposition that endeared her to everyone she met. The Montezuma School, as it was now officially known, had grown into an institution that attracted families from miles around. What had begun in the back room of Hartley's store now occupied a proper building with 3 classrooms, a library stocked with books purchased through the Ingram Educational Trust, and a reputation for excellence that had spread throughout Colorado. Katherine remained the heart of the school, though she now shared teaching responsibilities with 2 other educators, Miss Abigail Porter, who specialized in scientific subjects, and Mr. James Wilson, the music and mathematics instructor. As principal, Katherine focused on the youngest students, believing that a solid educational foundation in those early years would serve children throughout their lives. Mason had gradually transitioned away from mining work, focusing instead on managing the family's investments and serving as Montezuma's mayor, a position he had initially resisted, but accepted at the town's insistence 3 years earlier. Under his leadership, the town had installed proper water systems, improved roads, and even established a small hospital staffed by a permanent doctor rather than the circuit rider who had previously served the community. The copper mine that had transformed their fortunes continued to produce, though not at its initial spectacular levels. Mason had wisely invested the proceeds in a diversified portfolio of ventures, ensuring financial security for his family while funding numerous community improvements. The Ingram Scholarship Fund had already sent 4 promising Montezuma students to college in Denver or beyond, with the stipulation that they return to serve the community for at least 2 years after completing their education. On a crisp autumn morning in 1889, Katherine stood on the porch of their home, watching the sun illuminate the golden aspen leaves on the surrounding mountainsides. A cup of coffee warmed her hands as she savored a few moments of solitude before the household fully awakened. The screen door creaked behind her, and Mason joined her at the railing, his own coffee in hand. At 43, his hair had begun to show threads of silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened. But to Katherine, he was more handsome than ever, his face now reflecting a decade of happiness alongside life's inevitable challenges. "You're up early," he observed, slipping an arm around her waist. She leaned into him, comfortable in the familiar embrace. "I was thinking about today's anniversary." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Our wedding was in June." Katherine smiled, shaking her head. "Not our wedding anniversary. Today marks 11 years since I arrived in Montezuma on that stagecoach, thinking my life had taken a terrible wrong turn." "Ah," Mason nodded, understanding dawning. 11 years since you discovered there was no teaching position, and Harold Hartley informed you the school board chairman was deceased. 11 years since a kind cowboy with sad eyes gave me his last 5 pennies, she added softly. Having no idea what that simple act of generosity would set in motion, Mason set his coffee cup on the railing to pull her closer. "Best investment I ever made," he murmured against her hair, which was still the rich auburn of her youth, though she wore it in a more matronly style these days. "Though I couldn't possibly have anticipated the returns." From inside the house came the sounds of stirring life, Bobby's rapid footsteps overhead, Sarah calling something about a missing hair ribbon, baby Elizabeth's sleepy babble from the nursery. The peaceful morning was transforming into the controlled chaos that defined their household, a symphony of family life that both parents had come to cherish. "I have something for you," Mason said, reaching into his pocket. "I was going to wait until Christmas, but since you've reminded me of the anniversary." He pressed something into her palm, 5 copper pennies, newly minted and shining in the morning light. Katherine looked up at him questioningly. "Mason." "One for each member of our family," he explained, his eyes warm with love. "A reminder that the greatest wealth we possess isn't in bank accounts or copper mines, but in the life we've built together." He paused, a hint of mischief entering his expression. "Though if my suspicions about your recent morning indispositions are correct, we may need to add another penny soon." Katherine's eyes widened. She hadn't yet shared her own suspicions with him, wanting to be certain before bringing the news of another pregnancy. "How did you know?" Mason laughed softly. "I've been through this a few times now, my love. You have the same glow you had with Sarah, Bobby, and Elizabeth." His hand moved gently to rest against her still flat stomach. "Another blessing to add to our abundance." Katherine covered his hand with her own, tears of happiness pricking her eyes. "When I first came west, I thought I was pursuing a teaching career. I never imagined I'd find a family, a community, a purpose beyond anything I could have dreamed. And all because of 5 pennies, Mason mused. "Proof that wealth isn't measured by the amount given, but by the heart behind the giving." The door burst open behind them as Bobby barreled onto the porch, clutching a toy wooden horse Mason had carved for him. "Ma, Pa, Timothy says he'll take me fishing if you say it's all right." Katherine turned, slipping the 5 pennies into her pocket as she smiled at her energetic son. "After your lessons, Bobby, you know the rule." As Mason drew both his wife and son into an embrace, he caught sight of Timothy helping little Elizabeth down the stairs inside. while Sarah sat at the breakfast table already absorbed in a book. The scene embodied everything he'd once thought beyond his reach: a complete family, a home filled with love and learning, a future bright with possibility. From those first 5 pennies, truly, his last in the world on that fateful day had grown a life of immeasurable richness. Not measured in dollars, though they had been blessed materially beyond expectation, but in the currency that truly mattered: love, purpose, community, and the knowledge that they had helped create something lasting in this small corner of Colorado. As the family gathered around the breakfast table that morning, the conversation flowing between school plans and town business, fishing expeditions and dress fittings, Mason caught Catherine's eye across the happy tumult. The look they exchanged held 11 years of shared history, challenges overcome together, joys multiplied by sharing, and a love that had only deepened with time. Some might call it luck that a Boston schoolteacher with a counterfeit job offer had stepped off the stagecoach in Montezuma on the very day a struggling widower had chosen generosity over self-preservation. Some might attribute it to coincidence or timing or mere happenstance. But Mason and Katherine Ingram knew better. They recognized it as evidence of a greater design, a tapestry of lives interwoven with purpose, where even the smallest threads, like 5 copper pennies given from the heart, could become the foundation for a pattern of unexpected beauty and lasting significance. And as they continued building that pattern together through their family, their school, their community leadership, they remained ever mindful that true wealth was measured not in silver or copper or gold, but in lives touched, potential realized, and love freely given. A lesson they would pass down to their children, their students, and all who crossed their path in the small but thriving town of Montezuma, Colorado, where the simple act of sharing one's last 5 pennies had yielded riches beyond measure.